The old clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m. when Rosa finished cleaning the last classroom in the music building. Her back ached from bending over desks all evening, and her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors. But this was her favorite time of day. The hallways were quiet, the students were gone. She could finally be alone with her thoughts. Rosa had been working at Riverside University for 3 years now. Every night she would start at the top floor and work her way down, cleaning. Each room with the same careful attention. The professors never paid much attention to her. To them, she was just another face in the background, someone who made their world a little cleaner before they arrived each morning. But Rosa had a secret. Something that made her heart race every time she pushed her cleaning cart past the main lecture hall. Through the glass doors, she could see it sitting there like a sleeping giant, the beautiful black grand piano that commanded the center of the room. She had always loved music. Back in Guatemala, her grandmother used to hum old songs while they cooked together in the tiny kitchen. Rosa would watch her grandmother's weathered hands. She told stories about the village musicians who played at weddings and festivals. Music lives in the heart, her grandmother would say. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. If you feel it, you can make it. Those words stayed with Rosa even after she came to America, even when life got hard and she had to work 2 jobs just to pay rent. Even when people looked at her like she didn't belong in certain places, the music was always there in her heart, waiting. One night about 6 months ago, something changed. Rosa was cleaning the lecture hall when she noticed. Someone had left a beginner's piano book on top of the piano. She picked it up, curious. The pages were filled with simple songs and basic lessons. Without thinking, she sat down on the piano bench and opened the book. The keys felt cool under her fingertips. She pressed one key, then another. The sound was so pure, so beautiful, that it made her eyes water. She had never touched a real piano before, only the old keyboard at the community center that was missing half its keys. From that night on, Rosa started staying a few extra minutes in the lecture hall. She would sit at the piano and try to follow the lessons in the book. At first her fingers were clumsy and the sounds were all wrong. But slowly, very slowly, she began to understand how the keys worked together. She knew she was taking a risk. If anyone caught her, she could lose her job. But she couldn't help herself. The piano was calling to her and she had to answer. Rosa started watching piano lessons on her phone during her lunch breaks. She would sit in the parking lot, eating her sandwich with one hand while holding her phone with the other.
Ow.
Watching teachers explain how to read music and position her hands, she took notes on napkins and pieces of paper, writing down everything she could remember. The hardest part was learning to read music. Those little black dots on the lines looked like a secret code she couldn't crack. But Rosa was determined. She checked out library books and spent her days off studying. Slowly, the dots started to make sense. She began to see how they connected to the sounds she was making on the piano. Her fingers were getting stronger too. At first they would cramp, up after just a few minutes of playing, but now she could play for almost an hour without stopping. The calluses on her hands from cleaning were actually helping her press the keys more firmly. Rosa started writing her own music too. She couldn't help it. Melodies would come to her while she was working, and she had to get them out somehow. She would hum them while she mopped floors, then rush to write them down on whatever paper she could find. Her notebook was full of songs about her life, her dreams, her memories of home. The other janitors sometimes wondered why Rosa took so long in the music building. "Just clean it and get out," they would say. "Don't waste time in there." But Rosa couldn't explain what drew her to that room. How could she tell them about the way her heart felt when she played? How could she describe the feeling of creating something beautiful with her own hands? She was getting better too. The simple songs in the beginner book were too easy now. She had moved on to more complex pieces, things that made her stretch her fingers and really think about what she was doing. Sometimes she would play songs she remembered from childhood, figuring out the melodies by ear and adding her own touches. But Rosa was careful. She always made sure the building was completely empty before she sat down to play. She kept the volume low and always had her ears open for any sounds of people coming back. She cleaned that piano more carefully than any other surface in the building, making sure there were never any fingerprints or signs that she had been there. The hardest part was keeping it secret. Rosa lived alone in a small apartment. But even if she had people to talk to, who would understand? Her family back in Guatemala thought she was crazy for coming to America to clean buildings. They wouldn't understand why she was spending her free time learning piano instead of looking for a better job or sending more money home. But Rosa didn't care what anyone else thought. For the first time in years, she felt like she was doing something for herself. Something that made her happy in a way that nothing else did. When she played piano, she wasn't just a janitor. She wasn't just someone who cleaned up after other people. She was a musician. She was an artist. Late at night, after all her work was done, Rosa would sit at that piano and let her fingers tell her story. She played about missing her family, about the long days and tired feet, about dreams that seemed too big for someone like her. She played about hope and sadness and the strange feeling of being caught between two worlds. She never imagined that anyone was listening. She never thought that her music would reach beyond the walls of that empty classroom. She was just playing. For herself, for the pure joy of making something beautiful in a world that often felt harsh and cold. But sometimes, late at night when the building was supposed to be empty, Rosa could swear she heard footsteps in the hallway. She would stop playing and listen, her heart pounding, but the sounds would fade away. She would convince herself it was just her. Imagination Rosa had no way of knowing that her midnight concerts were about to change everything. She had no idea that someone had been watching, listening, and making plans that would turn her quiet secret into something much bigger than she ever imagined. Professor David Harrison arrived at the university earlier than usual that Tuesday morning. He had been teaching music theory for over 20 years. His reputation at Riverside University was built on excellence and precision. Students either loved him or feared him, but everyone respected his knowledge. He wore his success like a perfectly tailored suit, always pressed, always proper, always in control. David unlocked the main lecture hall and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar smell of polished wood and old paper. This was his domain, his kingdom, where he shaped the minds of future musicians. He had studied at some of the finest conservatories in the country, earned degrees that most people could only dream of, and performed with orchestras across 3 states before settling into teaching. But something was different this morning. As he walked toward his desk at the front of the room, he noticed papers scattered on the piano bench. That was odd. The cleaning staff was usually very thorough about keeping everything neat and tidy. He frowned and walked over to investigate. What he found made him pause. 3 sheets of handwritten music, covered in pencil marks and coffee stains. The paper was cheap, the kind you'd buy at a dollar store. The handwriting was shaky, with notes that looked like they'd been erased and rewritten multiple times. Out there were Spanish words written in the margins, translations of musical terms that any first-year student would know by heart. David picked up the papers and studied them more closely. The musical notation was ... unusual. Whoever wrote this didn't follow conventional rules. The timing was inconsistent, the key signatures were mixed up, and there were symbols that weren't even real musical notation. It looked like someone had tried to write music without really understanding how music worked. He almost threw the papers away. Almost. But something made him look again. Hidden beneath all the amateur mistakes, there was something else. A melody that actually wasn't terrible. In fact, if he was being honest, it was kind of interesting. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had been using his piano without permission. David folded the papers and slipped them into his briefcase. He would deal with this later. Right now, he had a class to teach. His advanced music theory students began filing in around 9 a.m. These were his best pupils, serious musicians, who had already proven themselves worthy of his time and attention. Most came from wealthy families, who could afford private lessons and expensive instruments. They dressed well, spoke confidently, never questioned whether they belonged in this room. David liked teaching advanced students. They understood the complexity of what he was sharing with them, appreciated the years of study and practice that went into mastering classical music. Like the beginning students who sometimes struggled with basic concepts, these young people could keep up with his rapid-fire lectures and detailed analyses. Good morning, class, David said as he stood behind his podium. Before we begin today's lesson on counterpoint, I have something rather amusing to share with you. He pulled out the crumpled papers from his briefcase and held them up for everyone to see. Several students leaned forward, curious about what their usually serious professor found so entertaining. I discovered these on the piano bench this morning, David continued, his voice taking on a tone that his students recognized as his teaching moment voice. Can anyone guess what they are? A student in the front row raised her hand. Sheet music, Professor. Well, someone certainly tried to write sheet music, David replied with a slight smirk. But this is what happens when people without proper training attempt to understand something as complex as musical composition. He walked around his desk and spread the papers out on the piano, making sure everyone could see them clearly. The students gathered closer, and David could see the mixture of curiosity and amusement on their faces. Look at this handwriting, he said, pointing to Rosa's careful notes. See how unsteady it is? And these markings here? They're not even real musical symbols. Someone clearly tried to learn music from YouTube videos or some other amateur source. Class chuckled, and David felt that familiar rush of satisfaction that came from having a captive audience. He was in his element now, the expert teacher showing his students exactly what not to do. And look at this, he continued, pointing to the Spanish translations in the margins. Our mystery composer felt the need to translate basic musical terms that any serious musician learns in their first month of study. One of his students, a young man named Trevor, whose parents had paid for piano lessons since he was 5, raised his hand. Professor, do you think it was one of the janitors? David paused dramatically, as if considering the question for the first time. Well, I suppose it's possible, though I'm not sure why someone whose job is to clean would think they could suddenly become a composer. The laughter that followed was louder this time. David could see his students were enjoying this unexpected entertainment. He had always believed that part of good teaching was knowing how to capture attention, and this was certainly doing that. The real tragedy, David continued, warming to his theme, is that whoever wrote this probably spent considerable time on it. Look at all these eraser marks, all these attempts to get it right. If only they had invested that time in getting a proper education instead. He held up one of the pages to the light, showing how the paper was worn thin from so much erasing and rewriting. This is exactly why we have formal music education, class. It takes years of study to understand even the basics of composition. You can't just pick up an instrument and expect to create something meaningful. What David didn't know was that Rosa was in the hallway outside, having arrived early to restock the supply closet next to the lecture hall. She had heard voices inside and recognized Professor Harrison's distinctive tone. She was just about to continue down the hallway when she heard him mention sheet music found on the piano. Her heart stopped. Those were her papers. The songs she had been working on for months, the melodies that came to her in the middle of the night, the music that meant everything to her. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping no one would come out and see her there. The saddest part, Professor Harrison was saying to his class, is that people like this don't understand their limitations. They think that wanting something is the same as being capable of achieving it. But music, real music, requires discipline, education, and natural talent that can't be faked. Rosa felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She wanted to run away, to disappear, to never have to face the knowledge that someone had found her private thoughts and turned them into a joke. But her feet wouldn't move as she stood there, frozen, listening to 20 young people laugh at her dreams. Now then, Professor Harrison said, finally folding up the papers and putting them away. Let's turn our attention to something that actually demonstrates proper musical technique. As the class settled down and Professor Harrison began his real lesson, Rosa finally found the strength to move her feet. She walked quickly down the hallway, her cleaning supplies rattling in her cart, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. That night, Rosa couldn't bring herself to enter the lecture hall. She cleaned around it, avoiding the room, where her secret had been exposed and ridiculed. For the first time in months, the piano sat silent and untouched, waiting for hands that were too hurt and too embarrassed to play. For 3 days, Rosa avoided the music building entirely. She switched her schedule around, asking other janitors to cover that section while she cleaned the science labs and administrative offices. But everywhere she went, she could hear Professor Harrison's words echoing in her mind. People like this don't understand their limitations. The phrase followed her like a shadow. Rosa tried to convince herself that it didn't matter. She told herself that she was being silly, that she should just forget about the piano and focus on her real job. But every night, when she got home to her small apartment, the silence felt different, heavier. The melodies that used to dance in her head had gone quiet, replaced by doubt and shame. On Thursday evening, Rosa was cleaning the third floor of the administration building when she ran into Carlos, another janitor who had been working at the university for almost 10 years. Carlos was from Mexico, and he had always been kind to Rosa, sometimes sharing stories about his family back home during their lunch breaks. "Hey, Rosa," Carlos said as he emptied a trash can. "You seem different lately. Everything okay?" Rosa paused, her mop dripping soapy water onto the floor. She hadn't told anyone about what happened, but suddenly she felt like she might burst if she didn't talk to someone. "Carlos," she said quietly, "can I ask you something? You think people like us, do you think we should stick to what we know?" Carlos looked at her with concern. "What do you mean?" Rosa struggled to find the right words. Should we try to do things that educated people do? Or should we just stay in our place? Carlos set down his trash bag and looked at her seriously. "Rosa, what happened? This doesn't sound like you." And then, to her own surprise, Rosa started crying, right there in the hallway. With her mop bucket beside her and the smell of cleaning supplies in the air, she told Carlos everything about the piano, about her music, about Professor Harrison and his cruel words. Carlos listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Rosa," he finally said, "my daughter back in Guadalajara, she's studying to be a teacher. When she was little, her teachers told her she wasn't smart enough for university. They said kids from our neighborhood should learn trades, not academics." He picked up his supplies and started walking with Rosa down the hallway. "But you know what she told me last month on the phone? She said, 'Papa, they were wrong. I belong here just as much as anyone else.' And she was right." Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But Carlos, what if I really am kidding myself? What if Professor Harrison is right?" "Rosa, in all the time I've known you, have you ever been a person who gives up easily?" Carlos asked. "You came to this country with nothing? You learned English while working 2 jobs? You send money to your family and still manage to save a little for yourself. Does that sound like someone who doesn't understand her limitations?" That weekend, Rosa couldn't stop thinking about what Carlos had said. She kept thinking about her grandmother's words, too. Music lives in the heart. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. If you feel it, you can make it. On Sunday afternoon, Rosa made a decision. She got dressed in her best clothes, a simple black dress she usually saved for church, and took the bus to the university. The campus was mostly empty, but she knew Professor Harrison often worked weekends. She had seen his office light on many times during her evening shifts. Rosa walked through the music building slowly, her heart pounding with each step. Part of her wanted to turn around and leave, but a stronger part of her knew that if she didn't do this now, she never would. Professor Harrison's office was on the 2nd floor, and sure enough, his light was on. Rosa could see him through the glass door, hunched over his desk with papers spread everywhere. She stood there for 5 minutes, gathering her courage, before finally knocking. "Come in," came his voice from inside. Rosa opened the door and stepped into the office. Professor Harrison looked up from his work, clearly surprised to see her. His office was exactly what she had expected: walls covered with diplomas and awards, shelves full of thick music books, and an expensive-looking violin in a glass case. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. "Professor Harrison," Rosa began, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm Rosa. I clean the music building in the evenings." Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by what looked like mild annoyance. "Ah, yes. Is there a problem with the cleaning schedule?" "No, sir. I came to talk to you about the papers you found, the sheet music." Professor Harrison leaned back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I don't want to make this into a big issue. Just ... Please remember that the instruments in the classrooms are expensive and meant for educational use only." Rosa took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. "Professor, those papers were mine." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Professor Harrison stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been embarrassment. "I see," he said slowly. "I know my music isn't perfect," Rosa continued, her words coming faster now. "I know I don't have the education that your students have, but that music, it means something. To me, it's my story, my feelings, my dreams, written down in the only way I know how." Professor Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Look, I appreciate that you have interests outside of your work, but music theory is incredibly complex. It takes years of formal study to understand even the basics." "I know that," Rosa said. "I'm not trying to say I'm as good as your students, but I am trying to learn. I watch videos, I read books from the library, I practice every chance I get." "Practice?" Professor Harrison asked, his eyebrows rising. Rosa realized she had said too much, but there was no going back now. "Yes, sir. After my shift, when the building is empty, I play the piano in your classroom." "I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help myself." Professor Harrison was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice was different somehow, not as cold as before. "How long have you been doing this?" "About 6 months," Rosa admitted. "I started with simple songs, but I've been working on harder pieces. And I write my own music too. So those papers you found, they were songs about my life." "Your life?" "Yes, sir. About leaving my family to come here. About working hard jobs and dreaming of something more. About feeling caught between two worlds. The one I left behind and the one I'm trying to belong to." Professor Harrison studied her face carefully, as if seeing her for the first time. "And you taught yourself all of this?" "Yes, sir. I know it's not the right way to learn, but it's the only way I could afford." The professor was quiet again, and Rosa began to worry that she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe he was going to fire her, or call security, or worse, but when he spoke again, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Play for me," he said. "Sir, if you really can play, if this isn't just show me. There's a piano in the classroom next door. Play something for me." Rosa's heart started racing again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from hope. Tiny, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally willing to listen to what she had to say through her music. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll play for you." Rosa's hands were shaking as she followed Professor Harrison down the hallway to the empty classroom. Her mouth felt dry, and her heart was beating so fast, she wondered if he could hear it. This was it. The moment she had been both dreading and hoping for since she first touched those piano keys 6 months ago. The classroom was dimly lit, with only the late afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows. The grand piano sat in the center of the room like a sleeping giant, its black surface reflecting the golden light. Rosa had played this piano dozens of times, but never with someone watching, never with someone judging. Professor Harrison pulled out a chair and sat down about 10 feet away from the piano. His face was unreadable, but Rosa could see the skepticism in his eyes. She could almost hear what he was thinking. "This is a waste of time. I should play a few simple notes and then I can get back to my real work." "Take your time," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't expect this to take very long. Rosa walked slowly to the piano bench and sat down. The familiar feeling of the keys under her fingertips should have been comforting, but instead it felt terrifying. What if she forgot everything? What if her hands cramped up? What if she proved him right about people like her not understanding their limitations? She closed her eyes and tried to remember what Carlos had told her. She thought about her grandmother's hands moving while she hummed old songs. She thought about all the nights she had sat at this very piano, pouring her heart into music that no one else ever heard. "I'm going to play something I wrote," Rosa said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Professor Harrison nodded, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. He was clearly expecting something simple, maybe a basic melody with simple chords, something that would confirm his assumptions about untrained musicians. Rosa placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft and hesitant, like someone carefully opening a door they weren't sure they should enter. But as Rosa's confidence grew, the music began to tell its story. It started with a melody that sounded like homesickness, the kind of deep, aching longing that immigrants carry in their hearts like a stone. Professor Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. This wasn't what he had expected. The melody was actually quite sophisticated, with unexpected chord progressions that showed real musical intuition. But Rosa was just getting started. The homesick melody began to transform, growing stronger and more determined. New voices joined in, her left hand adding bass notes that sounded like steady footsteps, like someone walking forward despite being afraid. The music began to tell the story of leaving everything familiar behind and stepping into the unknown. As Rosa played, she forgot about Professor Harrison watching her. She forgot about the cruel laughter of his students and the shame she had carried for 3 days. She was back in her own world. The world where music was her language and the piano was her voice. The song moved through different chapters of her journey. There were sections that sounded like the confusion of learning a new language, with discordant notes that resolved into harmony. There were parts that captured the exhaustion of working long hours, with repetitive rhythms that gradually built into something triumphant. Professor Harrison found himself leaning forward in his chair. This wasn't just music, it was storytelling. It was far more complex than anything he had imagined possible from someone without formal training. The way she moved between major and minor keys, the way she used silence as effectively as sound, the way each section flowed naturally into the next, these weren't things you could learn from YouTube videos. Rosa's playing grew, more confident as she reached the heart of her composition. This section was about the loneliness of being between worlds. Too American for her family back home, too foreign for many people here. The music captured that feeling perfectly. The melodies that seemed to reach for something just out of grasp, but then the song began to change again. Hope crept in through major chords and rising scales. This was the part about finding small joys in unexpected places. The satisfaction of a job well done, the kindness of strangers, the magic of discovering that she could create something beautiful. With her own hands, Professor Harrison realized his mouth was hanging open slightly. He closed it and tried to maintain his professional composure, but inside his assumptions were crumbling. This woman, this janitor he had dismissed so easily, was telling a story through music that was more moving than anything. His advanced students had produced all semester. The final section of Rosa's composition was about dreams, not the impossible. Fairy tale kind of dreams, but the quiet, persistent dreams that keep people going through difficult times. The music swelled with possibility, the radical idea that someone like her could create something beautiful and meaningful. As the last notes faded away, the classroom fell into complete silence. Rosa kept her hands on the keys for a moment, afraid to look up, afraid to see the expression on Professor Harrison's face. She had poured everything into that performance, all her hopes, all her fears, all her story. Finally, she raised her eyes to meet his. What she saw there surprised her. Professor Harrison wasn't looking at her with the condescending smile she had expected. He wasn't looking at her with pity or amusement. He was looking at her with something that might have been respect. That was ... double quotes he began, then stopped. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words. That was extraordinary. Rosa blinked, certain she had misheard. Sir, your composition, it's actually quite sophisticated. The way you develop the themes, the harmonic progressions, the emotional arc. Where did you learn to structure a piece like that? Rosa's voice was barely a whisper. I just played what I felt. Professor Harrison stood up and walked closer to the piano. You said you've been teaching yourself for 6 months? Yes, sir. And you wrote that piece yourself? Yes. Sir, it's about my life. About coming here. About working. About dreaming of something more. Professor Harrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different than Rosa had ever heard it. Softer, more human. Rosa, I owe you an apology. What I did the other day, showing your music to my class and making fun of it, that was wrong. I was wrong, Rosa felt. Tears starting to form in her eyes. but these were different tears than the ones she had cried after overhearing his lecture. "I've been teaching music for 20 years, Professor Harrison continued. I've heard thousands of student performances. But what you just played, that had something that can't be taught. That came from somewhere real." He paused, looking at the piano keys as if seeing them differently now. "You have a gift, Rosa, a real gift. I'm ashamed that I almost missed it because of my own prejudices." Rosa couldn't speak. She had dreamed of this moment of someone recognizing that her music mattered, but she had never really believed it would happen. "There's something else," Professor Harrison said. "Tomorrow I'm teaching my advanced class about emotional expression and composition. Would you, would you be willing to play for them? To show them what you just showed me?" Rosa barely slept that night. She lay in her small bed staring at the ceiling, replaying Professor Harrison's words over and over in her mind. Would you be willing to play for them? The question echoed through her thoughts like a song she couldn't stop humming. Part of her wanted to say no. The memory of those students laughing at her music was still fresh and painful. What if they laughed again? What if Professor Harrison changed his mind and decided this was all a mistake? What if she froze up in front of all those educated, privileged, young people who belonged in that classroom in ways she never would? But another part of her, the part that had driven her to learn piano in the first place, knew this was her chance. Maybe her only chance to show that her music mattered, that she mattered. Rosa arrived at work early the next evening, but she couldn't concentrate on cleaning. Her hands shook as she mopped floors, and she kept checking the clock on her phone. Professor Harrison had told her to come to his classroom at 2 p.m. the next day, right in the middle of his advanced music theory class. The next morning, Rosa called in sick to her day job at the grocery store. She spent an hour picking out what to wear, finally settling on her best black pants and a clean white blouse. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the nervous woman staring back at her. At 1:45 p.m., Rosa stood outside the music building, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Students walked past her, chatting and laughing, carrying expensive instrument cases and thick music books. None of them looked at her twice. Why would they? She was just another university employee to them. Rosa climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. She could hear Professor Harrison's voice coming from the lecture hall, explaining some complex musical concept to his students. The same students who had laughed at her work just days before. She knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Professor Harrison called. Rosa opened the door and stepped inside. The classroom fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from confusion to mild curiosity. She recognized some faces from that terrible day when she had overheard them laughing. "Class," Professor Harrison said, his voice carrying a tone Rosa had never heard before, respectful, even warm. "I'd like you to meet Rosa. She's going to help us with today's lesson on emotional expression and composition." One of the students, a girl with perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes, raised her hand. "Professor, isn't she the cleaning lady?" Rosa felt her cheeks burn, but Professor Harrison's voice cut through the awkward silence. "Rosa is a musician," he said firmly. "And today, she's going to teach us something about the power of music to tell a story." He gestured toward the piano. "Rosa, whenever you're ready." Rosa walked slowly toward the piano, aware that every eye in the room was following her. She could hear whispers starting behind her. What's going on? Is this some kind of joke? Why is the janitor here? She sat down at the piano bench and placed her hands on the keys. The familiar touch should have been comforting, but her fingers felt stiff and cold. She looked out at the sea of young faces, most of them wearing expressions of barely contained amusement. "I'm going to play a song I wrote," Rosa said, her voice barely loud enough for the back row to hear. "It's about my story." One of the male students snorted quietly, quickly covering it with a cough. Rosa saw Professor Harrison give him a sharp look. Rosa closed her eyes and tried to block out everything else. She thought about her grandmother's hands, about the late nights when she had played alone in this very room, about the music that lived in her heart regardless of what anyone else thought. She began to play. The first notes were the same soft, hesitant melody she had played for Professor Harrison the day before. But something was different this time. Maybe it was knowing that her professor believed in her. Or maybe it was the determination to prove herself to these young people who had dismissed her so easily. Whatever it was, Rosa found her confidence growing with each note. The whispers in the classroom stopped. The shuffling of papers and feet went quiet. As Rosa's composition began to unfold its story, the students found themselves drawn into something they hadn't expected. This wasn't the amateur fumbling they had imagined. This was real music, with depth and complexity and raw emotional power. That spoke directly to the heart. The melody told a story they could understand even without words. The story of someone who had traveled far from home, who worked hard for a little recognition, who dared to dream despite being told those dreams weren't for people like her. Trevor, the student who had made the joke about janitors a few days earlier, found himself leaning forward in his seat. He'd been playing piano since he was 5 years old, had taken lessons from the best teachers money could buy, but he had never heard anything quite like this. The music wasn't technically perfect. He could hear places where a formally trained musician might have made different choices, but it had something his own playing often lacked. It had soul. As Rosa moved into the middle section of her composition, the part about loneliness and feeling caught between worlds, several students exchanged glances. They might have grown up with privileges Rosa never had, but they recognized the universal human emotions in her music. The feeling of not quite belonging, of searching for your place in the world, of hoping for something better. These were feelings they understood. Professor Harrison watched his students' faces as Rosa played. He saw the initial skepticism melting away, replaced by genuine attention and, in some cases, something that looked like awe. These young people had been studying music theory for years, but they were hearing something that couldn't be taught from textbooks: the power of authentic expression. Rosa's playing grew stronger as she reached the hopeful section of her piece. This was the part about finding joy in small moments, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful, about refusing to let other people's limitations become your own. Her hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, her whole body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The final section soared with possibility and determination. Rosa poured everything into those last few minutes, all her dreams, all her struggles, all her refusal to give up on herself. The music filled every corner of the room, wrapping around the listeners like a warm embrace. When the last note faded away, the silence was complete. Rosa kept her hands on the keys, afraid to look up, afraid to see disappointment or amusement on the students' faces. Then slowly, she heard the sound of clapping. Rosa looked up to see one student standing and applauding, then another, then another. Within moments, the entire class was on their feet, clapping with genuine enthusiasm and respect. Trevor was clapping the hardest, his earlier smugness completely gone. The girl who had called her the cleaning lady had tears in her eyes as she applauded. Professor Harrison stood as well, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you, Rosa," he said, when the applause finally died down. "That was a perfect example of how music can transcend technical perfection to touch something deeper in all of us." He turned to his students. "This is what I've been trying to teach you all semester. Music isn't just about following rules or showing off your technical skills. It's about connecting with something real inside yourself and sharing that truth with others." One student raised her hand. "Rosa, how long have you been composing?" "About 6 months," Rosa replied, still hardly believing what had just happened. "6 months?" another student exclaimed. "That's incredible. Where did you study?" "I taught myself," Rosa said. "YouTube videos, library books, and practicing here at night after work." The students looked at each other in amazement. Here was someone who had achieved in 6 months what some of them were still struggling with after years of formal training. "Rosa," Professor Harrison said, "I have a proposal for you. Would you be interested in auditing some of our music classes? I think you could learn a lot, and frankly, I think my students could learn a lot from you too." Rosa felt tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "Really? You would let me do that?" "I think it's the least we can do," Professor Harrison replied. "Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted. Everyone deserves the chance to develop their gifts, regardless of their background." As the class ended and students filed out, Many of them stopped to shake Rosa's hand or compliment her playing. Trevor approached her last. "Rosa," he said, looking slightly embarrassed, "I owe you an apology. What I said the other day about janitors, that was wrong. Your music is better than anything I've written, and I've been studying piano for 15 years. Rosa smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot." As Rosa walked out of the music building that day, she felt like she was floating. She had done it. She had proven that music really did live in the heart, just like her grandmother had always said. She had shown that dreams don't have expiration dates, that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. From that day forward, Rosa's life changed. She continued working as a janitor, but she also became a student. Again, learning from professors who now saw her as a colleague rather than just hired help. And every evening when she sat down at the piano in the lecture hall, she played not just for herself,